All right, Facebook. I am back. Welcome back, Facebook. This is Mike Davis. We are live from the Oasis, our online study and our online fellowship. I am happy to be back with you. I thank God that I'm able to be back with you here. I was feeling a little bit under the weather last week, but I took some time to rest and I'm back and strong and happy to be here with you. Let's pray as we get into God's word for today. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you, Lord, for your spirit who guides us into all truth. And we look to your spirit to guide us this morning in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I just want to share with you this morning that number one, Aaron will not be here with us because he had something to do. So I'll be teaching this morning. You have me this morning, so I'll be teaching, make a little bit longer than normal, hopefully not too much. But we are still on the series. This is message number 78. So I know this is probably going to go over 100 message because we still have a lot of things to cover in our series, Who's the Boss? Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. We still got to cover Ephesians chapter 5. We still have to cover First Peter chapter 3. We still have to cover First Corinthians chapter 11 and First Corinthians chapter 14. So we got a lot to do. And as you know, I like to go in depth. So we probably are going to be hitting over 100 messages here. The reason we're doing this study, I just want to reiterate this again and why we are just taking time to go through this is because of the controversy as to whether or not whether women can be in ministry, whether, how are the power dynamics supposed to work in the home. And I hear a lot of things being said. This is something now that I have been studying for over, let's see, now it's been about 5 years just being deep into the study, constantly going back and looking at it. It's not the only thing I study, but this is one of the primary things, especially as we're sharing it here. And as I said before, we want there to be online, and we have a YouTube channel, KICTV. We want there to be online really rich and deep studies where you can go if you are being challenged concerning the equality of men with women as to whether or not women can function in leadership in the church where men are concerned, whether or not women can teach authoritatively in the church. We are going through all of that. And this part of this is um, done because we have other voices out there, complementarian voices that are saying that you can't do these things and they're reaching a wide audience. So pray for us that we will reach more people as we continue on in this study. And today we're looking at First Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. And I'm entitling this message, this is the second message, is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Is this talking about salvation through the birth of the Messiah? Is this verse talking about salvation through the birth of the Messiah? Now, one of the things that I have said, and I believe it's still true, that where this passage is concerned, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, let me read it. And it says here in verse 15, nevertheless, I'll start with verse 13. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam. Actually, let me back up to verse 11. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Verse 15 says, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self control. And as we said, where this passage is concerned, I believe with all my heart, having studied it, having read a lot of different articles and commentaries on this passage, we have to approach this passage with humility and grace, which we should approach all of the Word of God in this way. But this passage definitely, because this passage, by a wide consensus of scholars, it is very difficult to interpret. It is very difficult to understand. So we definitely one of the things I am seeking not to be, and I think about this as I'm doing my own study, Mike, don't be dogmatic, be gracious towards other people, even other people that you are disagreeing with, because this is a very difficult passage. I think this passage fits under the category of when Peter says there are some things that Paul speaks about that are hard to be understood because it's difficult, especially for us today when we are 2,000 years removed. Now, we looked at two interpretations of this passage in our last session when I was with you. We looked at what Dr. John MacArthur, Pastor John MacArthur, has said. He sees this verse as referring to when it says that the woman that nevertheless she will be saved in childbearing. He sees this as referring to the stigma or the shame that all women have due to Eve's sin, as recorded in Genesis chapter 3. According to John MacArthur, this stigma is removed when women fulfill their God given role of having and raising godly children. So he sees this, and when he talks about being saved, he sees it as this is not talking about the woman is saved by having children. He is saying that Eve, there was a stigma upon Eve that all women receive that as the daughters of Eve, and that is removed when they fulfill their God-given role of having and raising godly children. Or as MacArthur put it, they are to bear and raise them children for the purpose of being preserved or saved from stigma or accusations of inferiority. Now, we examined this in the very last lesson in detail and why this interpretation doesn't work. And by the way, one of the things I want to say about interpretations, remember I said before, there are a variety of interpretations where this passage is concerned. There are interpretations of this passage where there are complementary interpretations that will disagree with egalitarian interpretations and egalitarian interpretations that will disagree with complementarian interpretations. But then there are complementarians and egalitarians who hold the same interpretation of this passage. So, like I said, there are a variety of interpretations why we need to approach it with grace and humility. The second interpretation that we looked at says this that let's see, what do I have here? That says that second interpretation is that this passage means women are saved or preserved from sin, from Satan, from error if they adhere to their God ordained role centered on family or the home. So Andreas Kostenberger put this forth as a possible interpretation. We covered this in the last message number 77. You can go back and look at it. And he and others who hold to this see this as a call for women to maintain their place, that their proper focus, they're to maintain their place in their proper focus, which is to care for the home and the children. And he said that if women do that, then they will be protected from Satan, from sin, from error. And this is how he sees this. He sees the saving through childbirth, not as referring to they are going to be saved by, in other words, that they're going to save, be forgiven of their sins, go to heaven, live for eternity with God if they raise children. That's not how he's saying it. He says that they will be saved, that is, safe, kept from or preserved from sin, Satan, and error if they adhere to their God ordained role centered on family or the home. He says their proper focus is to care, their proper place is to care for the home and the children. This will also keep them, according to Kostenberger, if I'm pronouncing his name right, this will also keep them from the error or the sin of moving out of their place and trying to be teachers and leaders in the church over men. This is how he sees it. And there are others who see this. So if they stay in their place, they won't be moving out of their place. They won't be basically taking a place of authority over men and teaching in the church that they are not supposed to have. Okay. We also looked at this in great detail as to why this didn't work. One of the things I want to talk about his view that's held by him and some others a little bit more. Kostenberger sees childbearing, and we talked about this last week, as a synecdoche. A synecdoche is a figure of speech where a part of something stands for the whole. Okay, a part of something stands for the whole. And so it would be like or it represents the whole. So it would be like if I came and I say, like, I have my wife, my three daughters, I have grandchildren, I have a son-in-law, and I came and I said, I'm speaking for the whole family. Well, I'm a part of the family. Okay, I'm not the whole family, but I'm a part of it, but I represent the whole. That's a synecdoche. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. So where Kostenberger is concerned, he sees childbearing as a part that stands for the whole of something. So he sees childbearing as standing for or representing the entirety of the domestic lifestyle that women or wives are called to, and again, which will keep them from Satan, sin, and error. So I argue when we talked about this that he did not provide enough evidence of childbearing being a synecdoche. It was an assertion, from my point of view, it was an assertion without facts to back it up. However, as I did a little bit more research, I found an article that he wrote because I was reading some other material of his, where it's an article called "Ascertaining Women's God Ordained Role in Interpretation of First Timothy chapter 2, verse 15." And this is from the Bulletin of Biblical Research. You can actually find this online. Again, it's called "Ascertaining Women's God Ordained Roles and Interpretation of First Timothy 2:15." And in that article, which I did read a couple of times, he does appear, I'm going to put emphasis on the word appear, to provide evidence for his assertion that childbearing is a synecdoche. Okay. Now I said appear. I'm going to explain why I don't think he still makes the point or the argument. Now I have to say this about his article. It is actually a pretty good article. If you want to go and read it again, you can find it online. He gives a nice history, overview of the different views of First Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. I found that to be very helpful. He gives reasons why he doesn't believe certain views work. One of the views we're going to be talking about today, he gives reason why he doesn't believe that interpretation works. So again, we've got here he's a complementarian where he disagrees with other complementarians and some egalitarians as to what this passage means. So I would recommend the article if you're into reading it and wanting to understand. It's a good article. I don't agree with his conclusion, but it's a good article. All right. Now, what Kostenberger does, as I said, he appears to provide some evidence for his assertion that uh, childbearing is when it says that a woman will be saved by childbearing, that it is a synecdoche, appears to provide some evidence. He quotes in the article 3 extra non-biblical passages that have to do with marriage and having children. And in those passages, the word that's translated as childbearing, which is technogonia, two of those passages has the word that is used in First Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Childbearing translates in 2:15 the word technogonia, and it's translated as childbearing. So in his passages, there are two passages that have that term. Let me read to you what these passages are. And he says the first one is from Hippocrates and his letters from the first 5th century BC. So this is before the time of Paul. He says, "But why, my good man, should you not be refused? Should it not be inappropriate indeed to laugh at a person's death or disease or insanity or madness or melancholy or injury of something worse? Or conversely, at weddings or festivals or childbearing," here's the word here, "or religious rites or authorities and offices or any good thing?" So he says, should it not be inappropriate to laugh at things like a wedding, festivals, or childbearing, or religious rites, or authorities and offices, or any good thing? Excuse me. So it's evident, he says, it is evident that this reference is quite general to childbirth as events in life similar to weddings or other important occasions. He's talking about just in general, this is talking about general things that people do in life. The second reference is found in the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus in the Fragmenta Moraliae, which is a 3rd century BC text. And it says, quote, "Moreover, they say that making laws and training persons and also composing things which can be of value to those who read letters belong to those who are zealous both to submit to marriage and to childbirth for its sake and that of their homeland, and to endure it if necessary, and to endure for it if necessary both pain and death." So here is talking about uh, he says here, he goes on to say, as in the first reference, childbirth, here in the singular, is found in conjunction with marriage, here as a duty to be submitted to for their own sake and for that of their country. So here he's saying that, hey, here's a connection here between marriage and childbirth. We have the same thing in the quote from Hippocrates, where he talks about weddings, festivals, childbearing. Here, Chrysippus, it talks about being those who are zealous to submit to marriage and childbirth. And then there's a third reference from Aristotle's History of Animals, and it's a basic quote that says, "After 21 years, the females are in good condition to bear children, while men still need time for development." Okay, and that's from Aristotle's The History of Animals. Now, according to Kostenberger, the more recent passage in Chrysippus appears to involve the use of a synecdoche. Uh, People are submitting not merely to marriage and childbirth, but to married life and having children. Okay, so he sees this as a synecdoche. In light of these observations, this is from the article, and particularly the reference by Chrysippus, it seems perfectly permissible to understand technogonia, as in 1 Timothy 2:15, as referring not merely to the giving of birth, not merely to the giving of birth to children, but to the having of a family with all that that entails. So, um, let's see. Let's see if I want to read this here. Yeah. So Kostenberger sees the quotes that we just read from Chrysippus and from Aristotle and from Hippocrates as referring to childbirth. The two of them are using the term childbirth, tekgonia. Yeah. Wait, is he using? Yeah. The two of them are using the term, and he sees this technogonia. He sees this as proof from these quotes that technogonia is actually a synecdoche for the domestic lifestyle, because he says that, let me quote to him what he says again. He said, in light of these, or he says, the more recent passage in Chrysippus, however, appears to involve the use of a synecdoche. People are submitting not merely to marriage and childbirth, but to married life and having children. In light of these observations, and particularly the reference by Chrysippus, it seems perfectly permissible to understand technogonia, as in 1 Timothy, is referring not merely to the giving of birth to children, but to the having of a family with all that this entails. Okay, so this is where he appears to give evidence, because I was saying last week he doesn't really provide any evidence. And I read this article, went, okay, so he has some evidence here. So let me go back and talk about this. He appears to give evidence that, yes, it is a synecdoche. But the problem here is this: what is not clear is how Kostenberger extrapolates from this that the mention of childbirth or the use of technogonia in these passages indicates or stands for the whole of domestic lifestyle. In other words, he doesn't really show how exactly do you extrapolate from this the mention of marriage, the mention of childbearing, that this is therefore a synecdoche that stands for, that technogonia is a synecdoche that stands for all of the domestic lifestyle that women are obligated for. Because what he does again is he merely makes the assertion that it does. I don't really see him doing a sustained argument that proves that. Here's the reason why. In two of the passages, they mention weddings or marriages, and these are mentioned before childbirth. They're mentioned before technogonia. So, and the Chrysippus passage that he mentions is one of them. It talks about, let me read to you again what it says. In the Chrysippus passage, it says, moreover, they say that making laws and training persons and also composing things which can be of value to those who read letters belong to those who are zealous, both to submit to marriage and to childbirth for its sake. And that's all it says. It's talking about those who are submitting to marriage, and childbirth for its sake, and that there are certain things that have been written and put forth that are valuable to them. But it mentions in the context, it mentions marriage first and then childbirth. So here's my question: why is wedding? Oh, by the other verse, the other passage is the one he quotes from Hippocrates, who says, "But why, my good man, should you not be refuted? Should it not be inappropriate indeed to laugh at a person's death, or to laugh at their disease, or insanity, or madness, or melancholy, or injury, or something worse? Or conversely, is it not inappropriate," he's saying, "to laugh at weddings, or festivals, or childbearing, or religious rites?" Again, a wedding is mentioned. So here's my point. My point is, if he's saying, well, it's talking about these people submitting to weddings and childbirth, therefore this means that childbirth, technogonia, is a synecdoche for the domestic life that all women are supposed to submit to, and that's their place, and that is what First Peter 2:15 is saying. Why does he pick out childbirth and not focus on the fact that it mentions wedding and marriage first? Okay, marriage, and by the way, wedding, or why, my question is, I have it in my notes, why is wedding or marriage not chosen as the synecdoche, as that would make more logical sense? In other words, here the two passages, wedding marriage comes before birth. As a matter of fact, in one of the passages between the one by Hippocrates, he talks about weddings, festivals, childbearing. So between the wedding and the childbearing, there are festivals. Okay. Why not pick wedding or marriage as the synecdoche? In my thinking, that would make more sense because marriage would imply, marriage itself of a young woman would imply all of the duties and obligations that come with marriage. What are the duties and obligations in a first century Jewish and Greco-Roman world? Having children, managing the household, financial support if she has funds of her own. That, if you're saying you're getting married, that would imply that there is with that all of these different duties that come with it. So why ignore the fact that in the passages cited, wedding, marriage comes before childbirth? Why not say, well, the synecdoche is actually not, it wouldn't be childbirth, it would be wedding, it would be marriage. One of the reasons you couldn't do that because that would end up then it wouldn't support his interpretation because marriage is not specifically highlighted in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15. It would be implied if women are having children. If this passage is talking about women having children, uh, the implication would be that is probably talking about married women, but it is not highlighting. It's talking about women giving birth, not women getting married. But in the passages that he cites, it talks about weddings, it talks about marriage before childbirth. So, in my thinking, if I'm looking at this, I would go, well, it would be the wedding or the marriage. If you're trying to make an argument for synecdoche, it would be the wedding, it would be the marriage, not the childbirth. But again, that would not support his argument that 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 15 is utilizing childbirth as a synecdoche. That word is a little bit difficult to say. It's not using it, it wouldn't support his argument that it is being used as a part that stands for the whole. Dr. Stanley Porter, in an article, states why the synecdoche interpretation doesn't work. Let me read to you what Dr. Porter says in objection to this. Stanley Porter says that these solutions cannot be correct is first borne out two ways. The first way is by examining the use of the cognitive verb form in 1 Peter 5:14. Now, there is another form of this word, technogonia. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar to it, which is why they call it a cognate. It's like a cousin to this word, spelled a little bit differently, and it is used in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. Let's go over there and read that before I read the rest of Dr. Porter's quote here. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14 says, and this is Paul writing, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the household, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Now notice here the order: marriage, bear children, and here is using a word that is similar to technogonia. It's not technogonia, but similar to it. And also, he talks about managing the household. Now, these were the marital duties, these were the domestic obligations that was expected of women within the first century world. Okay, so Dr. Porter goes on to say that these solutions, Kostenberger's solutions, cannot be correct is further borne out in two ways. The first way is by examining the use of the cognate verb form in 1 Timothy 5:13. In that context, the author specifies that he desires for young women to carry out certain duties and responsibilities. We just read what those are, and so on. It is to be noticed that the three words form a logical and conceptual continuum. Now, which three words is he talking about? He's talking about that the women should marry, one, bear children, and manage the household. Dr. Porter says it is to be noticed that the three words form a logical and conceptual continuum in which marriage is differentiated from the bearing of children, which is also differentiated from the managing of one's household. So, what Dr. Porter is saying is that there are those who say that technogonia is a synecdoche. It's a part that stands from the whole. Yet we see here Paul differentiating each of these. He says, I want women to marry, and I want them to bear children, and I want them to manage household. Now, these are all duties, but he differentiates each of them. Dr. Porter goes on to say, it is difficult to see how childbearing forms an inclusive term with household management or any other duties. And this is from an article that he wrote called "What Does It Mean to Be Saved by Childbirth?" You can find that in the Journal for the Study of New Testament, number 49. It is online. The article again is called "What Does It Mean to Be Saved by Childbirth?" by Dr. Stanley Porter. So he is against this idea that it is a synecdoche because he said, if we look at chapter 5, verse 14, we see childbearing being differentiated from managing a household, being differentiated from marriage. Marriage is differentiated from bearing children. Bearing children is differentiated from managing the household. So he said, this is why that solution does not work. Now, he also states that it is equally illegitimate to include childbearing within a larger semantic range for technogonia, since the author apparently uses, and I believe it's technorofeo, which is another cognitive term, to denote this function. If you look at in chapter 5 again and look at verse 10, let's start at verse 9. He says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, taken into the number for those who need to be supported by the church. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken to the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work." Now, what he is saying here is that there is a word that is specifically used for bringing up children, and it is not technogonia. It's not that word. So he says it is illegitimate to include child rearing within a larger semantic range for technogonia, since the author apparently uses another term to denote this function. Now, Kosterberger pushes back on this, and he says, incidentally, the objection often raised against technogonia as a synecdoche in 1 Timothy 2:15, that is, in this case, the author would have used another term, which we see in 1 Timothy 5:10. He said it misses the mark. Now, this is Kostenberger saying, since the latter term merely specifies the raising of children, a sense required in the latter context, while technogonia, apart from its literal use, referring to physical childbirth, may pertain to the having of a family in a general sense. So he's saying, no, well, the context here has to use the term of raising children. To which I looked at that and I went back and I read over it again. And I thought, even though he makes an argument that this passage is not a counter to his view, because the context requires the use of this other term, it has to be acknowledged, though, that here too, Paul differentiates the various domestic duties that would be expected of the women or the widows so that they would qualify to be taken care of. In other words, he's not using here, look at all the different things. He says, if this widow is to be made part of the role to be taken care of, the role ROLL, if she's to be taken care of, she should have been the husband of one wife, well reported for good works. She has brought up or raised children. She has lodged strangers. She has washed the feet of the saints. She has relieved the afflicted, and she has diligently followed every good work. These are things that the ideal wife it would have been expected of her within the first century world. So my argument would be contra to Dr. Kostenberger. If technogogia is a synecdoche, why not use it here to stand again for all of the duties and obligations? Listen, in other words, we see here once again that there is differentiation being made between these duties. If Paul is seeking to utilize technogonia as a synecdoche, why not simply use it here? Why not saying, hey, if there's going to be a widow who is going to be who's under 60, if she's going to be part of the people that the church is taking care of, we need to make sure that she has given birth, and everybody would have understood everything that meant. He doesn't do that. He lays out all of the different duties which would have been expected of an ideal wife within the first century world. So my argument would be that Paul does not appear to utilize technogonia, because he could have utilized it here, but we see Paul using it one time. By the way, this is what's known as a hapax legomena. He uses it one time. It's the only place in Scripture that it is used, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So he does not appear to use this term as a synecdoche for a woman or a wife's domestic God ordained duties that she is to fulfill that will keep her safe from sin, Satan, and error. Paul doesn't appear to use it. He uses it one time, and then all the other times he lays out specifically the roles that women are supposed to do. He doesn't use or seek to depend upon this term to stand for everything that a woman is supposed to do. So I don't think Kostenberger has made a convincing case again, even with this additional extra non-biblical, what I mean by non-biblical, they're not in the Bible, the passages that he has cited. I still don't think that he's made a convincing case. At least it was not convincing to me, and it wasn't convincing to others, okay, other scholars. So I don't think that Paul is using techno, excuse me, that he's not using technogonia as a synecdoche to say that childbearing is referring to the God ordained domestic duties that women are supposed to do, that they are supposed to remain within, which will keep them from operating in positions of that men are supposed to occupy, which is teaching and leadership. In other words, Paul is not making a gender based argument against women functioning in leadership positions within the church and even over men. I don't think that is what Paul is doing based upon Kostenberger's uh, argument. I don't think it's a synecdoche at all. Okay. And by the way, let me say to his credit, because I also was watching Mike Winger where this is concerned, he also does not believe this. He doesn't agree that this is how the term is used. So kudos to Mike Winger. Want to give him his due where due is properly should be given. He also does not believe it pretty much for the same reasons that I don't. All right, let's look at another interpretation, and that is that this passage is speaking of the birth of the Messiah and salvation through the Messiah. That when it says verse 14, excuse me, verse 15, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self control. There are those who said that, well, the solution to this is that it is referring to the Messiah and the birth of the Messiah and the salvation that comes through the Messiah. So there are complementarians who hold to this view. There are egalitarians who hold to this view, and they believe that this is a possible interpretation. And I have to say, with every interpretation we're looking at, and even the ones that I lean more towards, they're all possible interpretations. I think some are more plausible than others. But until, like I said last time, until we get a document from the first century or very close to the first century, either before or after, that definitely says this is what this means, we are operating in the realm of this is possible, it is plausible, but we can't be dogmatic. At least I don't believe we can be dogmatic about it, because for just about every interpretation you bring forth, there can be arguments against it to say this is probably why this doesn't work, which is what I am offering here. I am talking about some. This is one that has become somewhat of a favorite by many people, complementarians and egalitarians. So this is a view held by some complementarians, not all. Mike Winger holds to the view that I'm getting ready to share with you. And this is a view that is held by some egalitarians, but not all. There are egalitarians like Philip Payne. There are egalitarians like Ben Witherington who hold that this is referring to the birth of the Messiah and the salvation that comes through him. Now, again, not all egalitarians hold to this view. Not all complementarians hold to this view, but there are complementarians and egalitarians who share it. So, first of all, we have to look at who is the she that is being referred to here in this view that's being held by many. It is singular in Greek. The word here, she, is singular in Greek. So there are those who believe that this is either referring to Eve, that she is the one who is giving the childbirth, or it is referring to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Yes, there are those who believe that this is referring to either Eve or Mary, the mother of Jesus. Dr. Ben Witherington states that the curse on the woman incurred in Eve is reversed through Mary. Now, there are those who believe it is Mary because it says that she will be saved through the childbirth. And they believe that this is the Messiah. I'll explain in a moment why they believe this is the Messiah. But they believe that this is the Messiah. Well, who is the one that gave birth to the Messiah? Mary. So there are those who believe that this is speaking here of Mary. And Witherington sees Mary here as an antitype of which Eve is the type. And what I mean by that is that Eve was kind of foreshadowing that which was to come, which was Mary, that Eve was the mother of all. Eve would give birth. And we're going to look at a verse of scripture that many appeal to, upon which they base the idea that this is messianic. The childbirth here is the birth of the Messiah. And I'll tell you what it is right now. It's Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. We're going to be looking at that in just a moment. But so they believe that Eve was kind of like uh, the prototype, or no, Eve was the type. Yeah, Eve was the. Am I doing this? Yeah, Eve was the type. Okay, she came before, kind of like the shadow, and then Mary was the antitype. She was actually the fulfillment. This is the one that it was of that kind of Eve foreshadowed. All right. Uh, so Mike Winger believes that is referring to Eve. He does not believe it's referring to Mary. And there are many scholars who do not believe it's referring to Mary. Mike Winger believed that this is referring to Eve as the mother of all, and thus she is also, because she is Jesus' ancestor, she is the mother of Jesus who is to be born. Okay. And he made an argument saying that just as in that time period, they could refer back to certain people being their fathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers. They would see Eve because she is the mother of all living. They would see Eve as the mother of the Messiah, being the ancestor. Not that she gave direct birth, but she would be the ancestor. Okay. But then there are those who say, well, no, this is referring to Mary because Mary is the one who gave birth. Again, the childbirth here is seen as referring to the birth of Jesus. Now, the reason they believe this is referring to the birth of Jesus is because when you look at this in Greek, you read it in Greek, there is an article, the, before the word childbirth in Greek. It's the Greek word for the. So in Greek, this can be read, in our English Bible, it says, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing. In Greek, it can be read as, nevertheless, she will be saved in the childbearing. And because it can be read as the childbearing, they believe that it is referring to Jesus. Okay, they believe that the word the should not, that the word the should be given more weight because it is there in the Greek. Dr. Ben Witherington, who is an egalitarian scholar, he believes this. He believes that the word the, he says in his book, Letters and Homilies for Hellenized Christians, Volume 1, which is a social rhetorical commentary on Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and 1st through 3rd John. Do I have that here? I thought I had it here. I had it here earlier. I must have put it away. Yeah, I put it away. But in that book, I wasn't going to quote from it, but in that book, he believes that the article the in the Greek should be given more weight because some scholars and translators don't give it a lot of weight. They don't see it, they don't believe it should be translated as the childbirth. So they just translate it like in my New King James, she shall be saved in childbirth. All right. They don't include the article the. Ben Witherington believes it should be emphasized. Mike Winger believes that the should be looked upon. It is believed in this view that by placing the article before childbirth, it's referencing a specific childbirth. So if it's saying the childbirth, that would seem to be referencing a specific childbirth. Ben Witherington states in his book, quote, which particular childbearing is meant? If you're saying she shall be saved in the childbirth, which childbirth or childbearing is meant? Surely the answer is Jesus, born of a woman, born under the law, and then he puts in parentheses as Galatians 4:4 puts it. And he references Galatians 4:4. Let me read to you Galatians 4:4 real quick. Galatians 4:4 says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, or made of a woman, born of a woman, can be translated either way, born under the law to redeem, that's 4:4. Then verse 5 says, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Okay, so let me take a sip of water here. So there are those who look, and Ben Witherington looked at this and said, well, see, it does talk about Jesus being born of a woman. The word the in the Greek is there. Mike Winger is among the complementarians, as I said before, who believes also that this should be that word the should be emphasized. He calls it soft evidence because he recognizes that there is some evidence against it, which we're going to talk about. So he calls it self-evidence. Okay, so the childbirth here is believed as referring to the birth of the Messiah, the birth of Jesus. It is believed by some that if the reference is to Eve, that it is alluding to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Genesis 3:15 says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman." This is when God is laying out what will happen because the woman and the man had eaten of the tree that was forbidden. So God shares this is what's going to happen where the woman and the serpent is concerned. I will put enmity between you, he's talking to the serpent, between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, I have to say that in my New King James, where it says, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel, they have it italicized, which means that the New King James is implying that this is referring to the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. So this is seen as a messianic promise by many, and they believe that this is what 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 is referring to. This is why Mike sees this as referring to Eve alone. He believes this is just referring to Eve and not to Mary. Now, there are some problems. Now, this is, by the way, this is how many get to this. They look at this, they say, well, let me expand a little bit more. So when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14 talks about Adam and Eve. It says, verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Eve was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved. So Mike Winger, as many have reasoned and argued, well, who is the she? Well, who is the she that was just spoken about? Who was the woman just talked about? Eve. So this must be talking about Eve. And when it's talking about Eve and childbirth, well, what do we see where God talks about Eve and childbirth? And they go back to the scripture I just read, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. She shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. And of course, then when God talked to Eve, he talks about her bearing children in pain. But that part is not seen as the messianic part. The messianic part is seen chapter 3, verse 15. So this is how they get to, this is talking about Eve, and that she is the one, through her would come the Messiah. She would give birth to the Messiah. She is the mother of all, as Mike Winger says. She's kind of the ancestor. So and he says they would have understood that this is speaking about Eve as the ancestor giving birth to the Messiah. They would have understood 3:15 as referring to the birth of Jesus, or the birth of the Messiah who would bruise the head of the serpent. Okay, I went back and I listened to Mike several times just to make sure I was understanding what he was saying. There are problems, though, with this messianic interpretation, though it is a favorite one, both among some complementarians and egalitarians. Okay, so what are some of the problems with the messianic interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:15? Number one, the idea that she refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and or to Eve, and that her salvation, whether Mary or Eve especially, is coming through the birth of the Messiah. Dr. Stanley Porter, again, to quote from him, he says, there is no logical progression from Eve to Mary in this text. Again, that is from his article, What Does It Mean to Be Saved by Childbirth? As I said before, Mary is often seen as being in this passage because it is believed that this is an allusion to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. This has been called in scholarship the proto-evangelium, the proto-gospel, or the first time that the gospel was declared through a prophecy. There is one coming, the seed who will bruise your head. I was taught this throughout my Christian life, that this is referring to Jesus. So Paul here is thus reversing the role of Eve by referring to, alluding to this voice, which would then point to Mary. Why would it point to Mary? Well, because Mary is the one who gave birth to Jesus. It was prophesied in, according to those who take this view, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And then Mary is the one who gives birth to Jesus. So it kind of reverses. It's not really talking about Eve, it's talking about Mary. But as Dr. Stanley Porter says, there is no logical progression from Eve to Mary in this text. We do see Eve being talked about in chapter 13 and 14. And then chapter 14 just says, she will be saved. to immediately insert in there, well, this is talking about Mary is making a large logical leap. How do you get to Mary? Other than that, you say that, well, but Mary's the one who gave birth to the Messiah. But up until then, there's been no mention of Mary. Okay. And again, like I said, Mike Winger himself disagrees that it is Mary. He doesn't see this as being Mary. Uh, Dr. Gordon Fee says that this is a most obscure way of saying this. If he's trying to say that this is talking about the birth of Messiah and that it's Mary, he said this is very obscure. Moreover, he says in his commentary, this is Dr. Gordon Fee, First and Second Timothy and Titus, his commentary on that. He says Paul nowhere else suggests that salvation is by the incarnation or by Mary's deed, and he's talking about Mary's deed of giving birth. Nowhere does Paul mention this. Nowhere does Paul teach this. And this is true. And this is something I looked at. I went, there's when I first heard that, I went, as one of the possible interpretations. At first, I thought, oh, okay, well, because again, this is a very difficult passage. I went, okay, well, that might make sense. But I thought, oh, wait a minute, you're saying that it's talking about Mary. Mary just kind of comes out of nowhere, and then nowhere else is the if you're saying that the childbirth is referring to the birth of the child, which is how it is interpreted. This is referring to the birth of the child, Jesus. Nowhere does Paul really point to the incarnation or the birth of Jesus as a means of salvation, because it says here that she will be saved by the birth of the child or by the childbirth. Paul nowhere else says this, and Dr. Fee says this also. Again, Mike Winger himself disagrees with this as referring to Mary. Complementarian scholar Thomas Schreiner also disagrees that this is referring to Mary. So I'm not alone, and you and Mike, we were looking at it and we're going, yeah, I don't think this is referring to Mary. And Thomas Schreiner, who is a complementarian scholar, also disagrees. Okay, I'll come back. We're going to talk more about this a little bit later. Let me move on. Mike Winger sees this as referring to Eve and to her salvation. Now, it would include Mary, but the focus is on Eve. So this is how Mike Winger interprets this. Now, he sees this because of Eve being mentioned, as I just said, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14, where it talks about, for Adam, verse 13, was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved. So Mike, again, and it's not a bad logical argument to say that the she here would be referring back to Eve. So it is Eve that it is speaking of, and she will be saved through the birthing of the child. Okay. And again, Mike sees this as the fact that Eve is the mother of all living. She's called that in the book of Genesis, and that the Messiah would come through her. So Eve was mentioned last in chapter 14, chapter 2, verse 14. So since Eve was mentioned in verse 14, it says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived, and that is speaking of Eve. Mike says, and others say, that it is Eve here who is being referred to. So Eve will be saved through the birth of the Messiah. And then it says, let me read again. Nevertheless, she, Eve, will be saved in childbearing or through the birth of the Messiah if they continue in faith. The word they there is taken to refer to now all women. So she refers only to Eve. They refers to all women. Now, Mike, in talking about this, says it may refer to men and women, but it is referring, he said, he believes it's referring primarily to women, okay, to all women. So Eve is referred to by the she, specifically Eve, only Eve. They refers to the women, okay? So Eve will be saved through the birth of the Messiah, and they, the women, are also going to be saved through the birth of the Messiah. Now, this is again problematic. Why? Well, when I went back and I listened to what Mike said and taught earlier concerning this passage, he said of Eve, when interpreting verses 11 through 14, let me read to you verses 11 through 14. Verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Now it has here, let a woman, singular. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now, the word man is singular. So Mike's view is, well, the reason Paul made it singular is because he's setting up to talk about Adam and Eve. Okay. So he talks about a man, a woman. Then he's going to talk about Adam, a man, and Eve, a woman. And Mike goes on to say, because it goes on to say, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression. So Mike argues that Eve here, Adam and Eve are prototypical humans that they represent, that Eve represents, and this is a direct quote, Eve, she is the one woman who represents all women in the example Paul gives. And this is that timestamp 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 19 seconds, in case you're wondering where I got it from. So Mike says, and he says this, if you go back, you look where he taught on this earlier. This is actually when he taught on it earlier. He says that Eve is the one woman who represents all women in the example that Paul gives. So he is seeing Eve in verse 13 and 14 as representing all women. Okay. But here's the problem. In verse 13 and 14, Eve is representing all women. But when he gets to verse 15, he changes his hermeneutic and he says, well, she is only referring to Eve. So when he gets to verse 15, he interprets the singular, and it is singular in Greek, the woman, as referring to Eve alone. And then he sees the rest of womankind being referred to when he says they. So in verse 14, according to Mike, Eve represents all women. But in verse 15, she only represents herself as a singular woman who gives birth to the Messiah for whom she is the ancestor. And of course, the Messiah then will save other women. But this changes how Mike at first interprets verse 13 and 14. He sees verse 13 and 14 as giving the reason for Paul saying, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over man, but to be in silence, because Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Eve was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. And Mike literally teaches and says in the video, Eve represents all women. So this is something that applies to all women. His interpretation, a complementary interpretation, is that Eve is supposed to be that there's a authority differential. Adam has more authority than Eve. This means that Adam, as a man, represents all men. So all men have more authority than all women, represented by Eve. Okay. So Eve is to be submitted to Adam or to the men, and he speaks about this in a church context. So they're to be submitted to, or submitted at home and submitted in church. So he sees Eve as being a representative of all women in his complementarian interpretation. But when he gets to verse 15, he says, well, we're talking about Eve, but now she no longer represents all women. And this just changes he changes the hermeneutic. It's like, well, what's your justification for saying in verse 14, she represents all women? But when it says she, because it's singular, now it is just Eve alone. And I say that's problematic. It's not being consistent because you're taking verse, and he admits he's taking from verse 14 and applying it to verse 15. But in verse 14, he says that this is Eve and she represents all women in verse 13 and 14. But then he changes when he gets to verse 15, says, no, it's just talking about Eve, and the they is talking about all women. Now, and I go, that's problematic because now you're changing it as you move, and it doesn't maintain the continuity. Somehow or another, between verse 14 and verse 15, it kind of went through some sort of transformational chamber where before Eve was the representation of all women, but when she gets to verse 15, she's just representing herself. And I go, that's a little bit problematic. How do you prove that? And somebody may say, well, because it's singular. Yeah, but it's singular when she's talking about when it mentions Eve in verse 13 and 15. It's just talking about Eve, you know? So how do you explain that? He doesn't explain that very well. Okay, in my opinion. And I don't mean this being mean. Again, like I said, this is a very difficult text to interpret. Now, Gordon Fee sees this differently than Mike does. Now, Gordon Fee is egalitarian. He doesn't hold that Mary is being spoken of here, and he doesn't believe that this is speaking of the Messiah being born. This is what he says. He sees the she in verse 15 as referring to Eve, but as Eve representing women, specifically the women in Ephesians spoken of in verses 9 through 11. So the difference would be Mike sees Eve and the prohibition, or when he uses Eve when Paul uses Eve in verse 13 and 14, he sees Eve as being representative of all women in all places at all times, except when it gets to verse 15, then it's just Eve, even though he borrows the Eve from verse 14. Gordon Fee says, no, it is Eve, which, by the way, I would agree with that. It is Eve, but it is Eve as the representative of all women. Excuse me, it is Eve as representative of women in Ephesus, which is what I have argued. I have argued that Eve is not, that when Paul utilizes Adam and Eve in verse 13 and 14, he is not speaking about all men or all women, specifically all women in all places in all times. He's specifically referring to what was going on in Ephesus. We have a whole video, I think 2 or 3 videos, where I talk about this in great detail and why. I give the reason why. I just don't state it, I give the facts. So, Gordon Fee says, yes, this is Eve. The she does refer to Eve, but it is Eve as the representative of the women at Ephesus, as she is in verse 13 and 14. Okay. Matter of fact, this is what Dr. Gordon Fee says. The subject of the verb will be saved is, in fact, the woman in verse 14, Eve. Obviously, Paul is not talking about Eve's salvation, but the women in Ephesus. Hence the change back to the plural in the middle of verse 15. So he is saying Eve is representing all of the women in Ephesus. And I would even be more specific. He is representing the women who are being deceived in Ephesus. And this is why he says she will be saved if they, so he sees they, he switches back to the plural because he sees the they as referring to the women who are being deceived in Ephesus. So what this does, it maintains the continuity of verses 9 through 14. Paul is talking about certain women, and this is one of the things, I'll say this again, when you listen to Mike, his argument sounds convincing, but his argument sounds convincing if you hold to that Paul is talking about all women. Because when he says, like when it says that when he reads verse 9 says, in like manner also that the women adore themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. And said, yeah, so when you go to church, you shouldn't be dressing in such a way where it's going to be drawing attention away from other people, which is how many people interpret that, or dressing in a way that is sexually alluring. But as we argue, when I taught this, this is referring to well-to-do women. This is not referring to all women in Ephesus. So Paul is not arguing against all women and their clothing. And he is not simply saying, as Mike kind of argues, that this is about how women are to dress when they go to church. And I would say no, because within a first century Greco-Roman context, if women are wearing expensive clothing, that could be seen as a mark against them, whether they're at home or whether they're at, quote, church, this will be seen as a mark against them. So this goes beyond just, quote, a church service. This is how they are to live and conduct their lives. All right. So Paul is saying that, uh, uh, listen, women, those of you that are well to do, you're going out there, you're showing off your wealth. This is, which is basically what you're doing. And we talk about why they did that. He forbids them from doing that. And I talk about that these are the same women that Paul is saying, I do not permit you, I am not permitting these women, these well-to-do women, to teach or to exercise or to domineer over a man, to authoritate a man, to dominate. I believe it should be that. Go back to the videos as to why I say it should be domineering. It fits with the context, it fits with the social and cultural values that many people held to in that day. All right. So when Paul gets to verse 14, 13 and 14, he's talking about Eve. He is using it as an analogy to speak about what these rich, well to do women are doing. They are being deceived. They have been deceived by false teachers. They are spreading the false teachers. I know Mike Winger doesn't believe that. However, I believe that. I've given reasons why. We talked about why. Again, go back and watch the videos. They are being deceived. And so they are not allowed to teach, and they are not allowed to exercise, not exercise, they're not allowed to be domineering over the men. And I give reasons how those who are rich will be one of the things that was believed and that they not only believed, they actually practiced was domineering over others. Okay. So Paul begins to utilize Adam and Eve to speak about what's going on in Ephesus. But he's not talking about every single woman when he mentions Eve. He's talking about a specific group of women. So when he gets to verse 15, he says, it is Eve. As Dr. Fee says, I agree with this. It is Eve, but it is Eve as the representative of the women, well to do, who are deceived, who are spreading false teaching, and who are engaging in behaviors that are not virtuous and godly. These are the women who are, when Paul says they will be saved, these are the women that Paul is talking about. Okay. If you take she as Eve as representative of all the women and they as referring to all of those women, this is who he's talking about. Now, let me say there are other interpretations of this, which I will be sharing, okay, in the coming weeks to come. But I'm just saying this is an argument, and there is an objection to seeing, as Mike sees it, that, well, it's talking about Eve in the first instance and Eve alone, but then when it says they, it's talking about the women. I would argue no, it's talking about Eve, as Dr. Fee does, it's talking about Eve as the representative of all the women, and then that all of these women, they will be saved through childbearing. Now, the question becomes again, what exactly is the childbearing? And we'll get into that in just a moment. So, um, if Paul is, I'll read the last sentence I have. If Paul is talking specifically and only about Eve when he says she will be saved, we have to ask, why does he change the analogy? Why shift from her being a representative of the women to speaking of her and her salvation alone, though it extends to other women? Why is he all of a sudden shifting and saying, no, I'm just talking about Eve right here? And now, well, I'll just say that. So why would Paul all of a sudden shift? There is no need for him to shift. It maintains the continuity of his thought if Eve stays a representative of the specific women at Ephesus as he utilizes it in verse 13 and 14. Okay. If it becomes Eve herself, all of a sudden we've broken the continuity of Paul's thought. Now, the other question would be like, why did Paul bring this up in the first place? So we're going to be talking about various reasons why. Now, 1 Timothy 2:15 and the idea that the childbirth is referring to the birth of Jesus. Let me talk about this. I said I was going to come back to that. As I said, this is seen by some as alluding to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where it is said, let me read it to you again, Genesis 3:15. Where's it at? Um, Genesis 3:15. What did I do with it? Okay. Like I lost the verse all of a sudden. Genesis 3:15. And oh, there it is. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, again, many see verse 15 of 1 Timothy 2 as referring to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Are there some problems with that? There are some problems with that. And this is where we'll end. Okay. What has been called the proto-evangelium, the proto-gospel, being proclaiming the Messiah in a prophecy. This is how some interpret Genesis 3:15. It sees that passage as speaking of the Messiah. This is nowhere attested in the prophets, in Paul, or in extra non-biblical literature before the time of Paul or during the time of Paul. Let me say that again. The idea that Genesis 3:15 is referring to the Messiah, that it's a prophecy to the Messiah, we do not have any place where this is attested to in the prophets in the Tanakh, okay, the prophets in the Bible. Nowhere do they quote or cite Genesis 3:15 as a coming deliverer. It is nowhere in Paul. Paul never quotes Genesis 3:15, nor in extra non-biblical literature outside of the Bible. So in the rabbis, because I was thinking about this, I went, I don't ever, when I was studying under Dr. William Bean, and we were studying the Jewish roots of Christianity, we were studying the Jewishness of Jesus. My focus and passion was understanding Paul in his Jewish context. So I would read as much as I could not religious, rabbinic literature in order to try to understand Paul. And I would look up different things and utilizing the meager resources I had at the time. But in all of the years, I've never seen anything in rabbinic literature, either before the time of Paul or during the time of Paul, where they quote Genesis 3:15 and state it as pointing to the Messiah, that this is speaking of a coming deliverer. As far as I know, within the Qumran literature, there is no interpretation of Genesis 3:15 as referring to the Messiah. Okay. Now, within Christianity, we have said this is pointing to the Messiah. But what I'm saying is that we don't see Paul saying it. We don't see Peter saying it. We don't see John saying it. We do not see Jude saying it. We don't see anyone saying it. We don't see it in the Gospels. In all of the Gospels, which talk about the Messiah, and Jesus references different passages that speak of the Messiah, Genesis 3:15 is never cited. Okay. And we never see it in the prophets. So Paul nowhere appears to the passage. To say that Paul is appealing to Genesis 3:15 in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 is again to make an assertion, which is what Mike did. He said Paul is alluding to or pointing back to Genesis 2:15. That's to make an assertion without evidence to back it up. All right. So Mike has stated this, and there have been others. I'm not picking on Mike. Others have also said that, and what they have said is that they said that this has been attested to, that this meaning that 1 Timothy 2:15 is talking about Genesis 3:15. They said, well, this is attested to by the early church fathers. So when I heard that, I went, okay, I'm not an expert on early church fathers, but I began to look at some passages that were pointed to. I went and looked them up and read them several times. Okay. So Mike in his video number 12 at timestamp 10 hours and 36 minutes and 47 seconds, he says, quote, I want to point that out. Also, I will say, let me read this again. He says, I will say in benefit of a pro of my view, his view is that 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 is alluding back to Genesis chapter 3:15, which is a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. Mike says, in pro of my view or in support of my view, he said it's a super early view it's a super early view. This was held by several church fathers. So Mike's saying this was a view that was held. It was an early view held by several church fathers. This is a very early view. It's not something new. It's not some new invention coming later on. The childbearing in verse 15 was thought very early on to refer to the Messiah. Now he's saying that the early church fathers held this view, that they taught this view, that the childbearing in verse 15 of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, and in Genesis chapter 3:15, that this was thought early on to refer to the Messiah. Genesis 3:15 referred to the Messiah, and that the childbearing in 1 Timothy 2:15 referred to the Messiah. He says this was held by several church fathers. It's an early view. It is not some new invention. Mike is incorrect. He's incorrect. I went and looked up the quotes of the early church fathers who are said to have held this view. So I read Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, chapter 100, Ignatius, Ephesians, commentary 19, Irenaeus, he has a work called Against Heresy, book 3. He talks about it, and book 5, chapter 19. And also Tertullian, he has a work called On the Flesh of Christ, chapter 17. I went and I read these several times. What you will find is they do mention Eve and Mary together, but it is as a type and antitype. Again, Eve is the type, Mary is the antitype. And it basically, almost all of them kind of read like this. Through Eve came sin, death, and the fall. Because even a lot of early Jewish works blame Eve. Paul never blames Eve. He says that death came through one man. Paul never lays it at Eve. But some of these early church fathers did, some of the rabbis did. So the idea basically when you read these early church fathers is that through Eve came sin, death, and the fall. but that through Mary came salvation, life, and restoration. So you kind of have Mary as the antitype to Eve in reverse. Eve brought death, Mary brought life. Eve brought damnation, Mary brought salvation. Eve brought sin, and Mary was able to bring through the birth of the Son a restoration to righteousness. This is how they are portrayed together. However, however, there is never one mention or a tie to 1 Timothy 2:15. None of the church fathers mention or tie in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15 when they talk about Mary and they talk about Eve. And none of the church fathers tie in first Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 to tie in to 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15 when they're talking about Mary and when they are talking about Eve. They never bring those passages together like that. There is a scholar, and by the way, just to let you know, just to make sure I wasn't missing it, I read it several times, every single one of them. And I thought, okay, just make sure I'm not missing anything. Let me read. So I read about 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times, every single one of these passages. They talk about Eve and what she did. They talk about Mary and what, the promise coming through her, but they never tie it to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So Mike's assertion that the early church fathers saw the childbearing as pertaining to the birth of the Messiah, they never even mention 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. They never mention it. Okay. Christopher Hudson, who is a scholar, he's written a commentary called 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. He's written a commentary on this. This is what he said. And he was the one that alerted me to this because I kept hearing people say, well, the church fathers referred to it. The church fathers referred to it. I'm like, oh, okay. And then when I was reading his commentary, I was doing a little bit of extra research. Uh, this is what he said. The most popular figurative interpretation reads the woman as a type for Mary and takes the Greek phrase through the childbirth as an allusion to the birth of Jesus, which is what we've talked about. He talks about different scholars who see it this way. Some patriist, some patristic texts, this is the text of the church fathers, some patristic texts, and I just read them to you because he has them listed here. That's how I was able to go look them up. Some patristic texts do refer to an Eve Mary typology. And he lists all the ones I just shared with you. But they do not tie that typology to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So the patristic support for this interpretation is illusory, meaning those who say the church fathers support a reading of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 as referring to the birth of the Messiah, they do not. Yes, they talk about Mary. Yes, they talk about Eve, but they talk about them, as he says here, as an Eve Mary typology, as a type and antitype. But if you go and you read it, there is no mention of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, and how this means that Eve or Mary is giving birth to the Messiah, tying it back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. He says this interpretation, saying that it has patristic support, it is illusory. It is incorrect. It is wrong. So Mike is wrong when he says, hey, this is an early view from the church fathers that 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 is referring to the Messiah. It does not. It does not. Okay. So here's the thing. We have no early pre-first century or first century evidence of Genesis 3:15 being interpreted as referring to the birth of the Messiah. Now, if you like me, you probably have heard this a lot. I have yet to see it. Now, if somebody's out there, you said, nope, Mike, there is. Send it to me. Private chat me. Send me the actual quotes where I can go look them up, and I will bring a correction here. All right. But at this point, I have not seen it. I did some digging to see if there was something out there. I did see some things where people were trying to make a case for a royal theme behind Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, but you have to go through a lot of different things to get to, and this is referring to the Messiah. Um, it was believed at one point that there was some uh, Targumic evidence of Genesis 3:15 as being messianic. Let me explain that for a second. What is that Targumic evidence? There are Aramaic works known as Targums that are Jewish commentaries on the scriptures. They're written in Aramaic, and the purpose of them is to provide interpretation of the text. There was believed at one point that there was some Targumic evidence of Genesis 3:15. In other words, in the Targums, that there are some Targums who would see Genesis 3:15 as being messianic. However, a scholar by the name of Christian Brady, in an article called The Messiah in the Targum, and this was published on July 31st, 2024, so last year. Uh, this scholar presented this paper at the Society for Biblical Literature in Amsterdam. You can find this article at targum.org. Okay, it's called The Messiah in the Targum. This scholar has demonstrated that it's not the case, that what we thought was that the Targums were saying that Genesis 3:15 was pointing to the Messiah. It was not just the case, and I won't get into really why, but one of the Targums that they were talking about that they thought was an early Targum in the land of Israel, it has now been dated to, I believe, the Middle Ages, and that it was put together in Italy. Okay, so that kind of does it away with it being a first century witness to Genesis 3:15. So let me say too, I'm not saying that there are not much later uh, rabbinic interpretation, but they're much later, much way after the time of Paul, where it talks about Genesis 3:15, even in Judaism, as referring to the Messiah. But they are much, much later. Okay. What I'm saying is we don't have any first century or pre-first century evidence of Genesis 3:15 as referring to the Messiah. Now, the earliest extra non-biblical text that does refer to Genesis 3:15 as referring to the birth of the Messiah is by one of the church fathers, Ignatius, and he states that Genesis 3:15 is talking about the birth of Jesus. However, he writes in the 2nd century in 180 CE, approximately 115 years after the death of Paul. Okay, so again, we don't have a first century witness. The earliest, as far as I can tell, as far as other scholars can tell, the earliest extra non-biblical text, meaning that it's not in the Bible, it comes from a Christian by the name of Ignatius. He wrote in the 2nd century, approximately 115 years after the time of Paul. He composed this in 180 CE, and he is the one who writes and says Genesis 3:15 is referring to the birth of the Messiah. People will point to this, and Mike might, I don't know if Mike points to this, he might point to this. It's a later text, though. So we cannot say with any type of certainty, unless somebody can show me a text that says it, that this is referring to the Messiah. Now, I know people can do word studies and say, well, if you look at this, you look at this, but we don't have the prophets. We don't have Paul. We don't have Peter. We don't have John. We don't have Mark or Luke or Jude or James. No one points to Genesis 3:15 and says, and the deliverer will come. You see in Ezekiel where it talks about David, okay, and how David will come. That's speaking of the Messiah. You see in Daniel chapter 7, one like the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Jesus makes that applicable to himself. You see in the book of Isaiah where it talks about that there will come a time when the lame shall walk and the deaf shall hear, and this is seen as pertaining to the days of the Messiah. And we see this quoted by Jesus in Matthew chapter 12, okay? We do not see anything like that where Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is concerned, where Jesus claims that that is speaking of him, where Paul, Jude, James, the writer of the book of Hebrews, whoever that may be, where Matthew, Mark, Luke, no one claims Genesis 3:15 as being a prophecy speaking of the Messiah. I know that's part of Christian tradition, and somebody said, "Well, what are you saying, Mike?" I'm saying it could be, but what I'm saying is there is no evidence for it for a first century or pre-first century for that text being interpreted that way. We don't have anything. Okay, so we can't say it. So again, seeing 1 Timothy 2:15 and saved by childbirth as a reference to let me slow down because I want to make sure I said the right thing. Seeing 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, and the phrase saved by childbirth as a reference to Genesis 3:15 and as a messianic prophecy, it doesn't work based on the evidence that we have. There's an accumulation of evidence that says this interpretation just doesn't work. All right. Now, like I said, there are both complementarians and egalitarians who hold to this point of view, but there are some problems with it, and this is what I've shared with you today. All right, we are done. I hope that made sense. Again, the reason I'm sharing this is because we are building towards what I think may be two very plausible interpretations of this text. I may share just a little bit more about this next week, but we are going to be getting into the possible slash plausible interpretations of this text and why I believe they are possible and plausible. I'll be sharing with that with you next week. If you enjoyed this, please give, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, KIC TV, give us a like, give us a, click on that button for the thumbs up. Tell your friends about it. Share the video. That helps with the algorithm. We want this information to get out because I see it as this. When we tell the truth about our sisters in Christ and where they stand, it will set them free. I've had many people write to me behind the scene and say, Mike, thank you so much for sharing this. This is really helping me. So please share it with other people. This will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, KIC TV, within the next 24 hours. I also have to load the one that I shared 2 weeks ago, but they will be up within the next 24 to 48 hours, actually within the next 24 hours. I'll make sure I get that done. Until then, God bless you. Thank you for being here with me. Lord willing, I will be back here next week. We're going to talk some more about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, a little bit more of talking about this idea of, is this referring to the birth of Messiah? I have a few more things I think I'll share, and then we'll start moving into what could it possibly mean. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week, Lord willing. Bye-bye.